You know, back in the day, Marvin really had a way with all the ladies. If you put him on a record with a woman, he just wrapped himself around her voice. Whoever she was, he made her sound better. He lifted everybody's game. In the last years of his life, Marvin Gaye moved through the world as if death were already sitting just outside his door. He told the people closest to him the same chilling line again and again, "I won't live long." Nights stretched without sleep. Curtains stayed drawn even in daylight. Fear became part of the daily routine. According to his brother, Frankie Gaye, Marvin was not simply anxious. He was convinced that something or someone was watching him, marking him, and closing in step by step. In that heavy silence, odd private rituals began to surface. Candles burned in rooms that were otherwise completely dark. Soft, muted prayers were repeated over and over, not with the peace of worship, not with the confidence of faith, but with the desperation of a man trying to push back an invisible deadline. These were not organized satanic ceremonies. They were improvised acts, born out of terror, carried out by someone who believed death had already circled his name. This investigation follows Frankie's account, down into Marvin's final descent, and circles one disturbing question: was Marvin Gaye really trying to escape death, or was he slowly preparing himself to walk toward it? Chapter 1: Violent Faith, a Child Taught to Fear God, 1940 s. 1960 s. Before Marvin Gaye became a symbol of romance, vulnerability, and spiritual longing, he was a scared boy in a small Washington, D.C. house where religion did not comfort, it threatened. Marvin was born on April 2, 1939, into a family ruled by strict faith and unpredictable rage. From the sidewalk, the Gaye household looked devout and disciplined. Inside it was a place where scripture and punishment shared the same breath, and where fear learned to hide behind the word God. His father, Marvin Gaye, was an authoritarian minister in the House of God, a Pentecostal denomination known for rigid moral codes. In the pulpit and at home, he preached obedience, purity, and divine judgment. But those principles were not passed down with patience. They were enforced with physical violence. According to multiple family accounts, discipline in the Gaye house meant beatings, swift, severe, and justified as spiritual correction. As a child, Marvin learned early that faith was not a safe place to run to. It was a test he could fail at any moment. Frankie Gaye later described images that never left his mind: Marvin praying alone in corners of the house, Marvin singing hymns under his breath, not with joy, but with dread, Marvin flinching at the slightest rise in his father's voice, convinced that any misstep, real or imagined, would bring punishment. He believed God was always watching, Frankie said years later, and not in a loving way. In that environment, fearing God did not mean reverence. It meant survival. The beatings were not random outbursts. They followed a pattern. Marvin Gaye, believed he was saving his son's soul. Each blow was framed as duty, each bruise as a lesson. Obedience meant safety. Fear was proof that the lesson had landed. Over time, Marvin internalized this brutal logic. If something went wrong, it must be his fault. If pain arrived, he must have deserved it. Yet in the middle of all this, one escape route appeared: music. As a boy, Marvin discovered that his voice could do something his body never could. It could leave the room. Singing in church gave him temporary protection. When he sang, the house grew quieter. When he sang, his father listened. Music became both a shield and an offering, a way to earn short-lived mercy. But even this gift carried its own chains. Marvin Gaye encouraged his son's singing not as self-expression, but as service. Talent wasn't treated like a blessing. It was a responsibility to God. This contradiction cut deep. Marvin loved gospel music, but the sound of it was welded to fear. He believed in God, but he expected punishment. He prayed often, but his hands shook. Frankie would later say, Marvin prayed like someone trying to avoid something, not like someone asking for help. As Marvin stepped into adolescence in the 1950, the tension grew sharper. Puberty brought curiosity, desire, and emotion, everything his father's doctrine condemned. Any sign of sexuality was labeled corruption. Any drift from rigid holiness provoked rage. Marvin began to see his own body as a problem, a walking source of sin waiting to be discovered. That fear followed him everywhere. At school he stayed withdrawn, guarded. At church he was celebrated for his voice, but closely watched. At home there was no such thing as true safety. Over time, Marvin developed what modern psychologists might describe as early signs of chronic anxiety. He became hypervigilant, always scanning for danger. Sudden noises made him jump. Confrontation terrified him. Worst of all, he began to believe that punishment was inevitable. God in Marvin's mind was no longer a protector. He was a sleepless judge. Frankie remembered nights that captured this perfectly. Marvin would wake up in the dark convinced he had done something wrong, unable to name what it was. He would fall into frantic, repetitive prayers begging for forgiveness without even knowing the specific sin. He thought if he didn't pray enough, something bad would happen, Frankie said. And if something bad happened, it meant he hadn't prayed right. Fear. Prayer. Brief relief. Fear again. That loop became the engine of Marvin's inner life. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Marvin began to physically leave home, but the damage stayed strapped to his back. He joined the Air Force briefly, clashing with authority and rigid structure. He drifted toward music scenes where spirituality seemed looser, more alive, less punishing. And yet, even as his career slowly formed, the inner conflict never healed. Faith still lived inside him, but it was split, half devotion, half terror. This matters because it explains what came later. When Marvin Gaye faced serious pressure as an adult, failure, loss, addiction, public conflict, his mind returned to the frame it had been given as a child. If something terrible was happening, he believed it was because he was being punished. If danger felt close, judgment must be on its way. And if judgment was coming, he needed to prepare. Frankie would later say something that still chills listeners. When Marvin was scared, he didn't think like a grown man. He thought like that frightened kid again. That child never really left him. The violent faith of Marvin's upbringing did not vanish when he became famous. It hid under the applause. It waited beneath the records, beneath the interviews, beneath the image of a man who sang about mercy and love. And when his life began to fracture decades later, that early equation, God equals fear, punishment equals destiny, came roaring back, turning prayer into ritual belief, into obsession, and anxiety into full-blown paranoia. This chapter is not about attacking religion. It is about showing how faith delivered through violence can break a mind in ways that stay hidden for years. Marvin Gaye was taught that love comes with pain, that God speaks through punishment, and that safety never lasts. Those lessons became the foundation of his inner world. And once that foundation cracked, everything built on top of it started to fall. Before Marvin feared death, he feared God. Before he feared God, he feared his father. And long before the midnight rituals, the paranoia, and the final gunshots, there was a boy kneeling in silence, praying as if he was already condemned. Scandals, financial collapse, and the rise of paranoia, 1978, 1981. By 1978, Marvin Gaye's public image still looked like victory. He was revered, influential, and praised as one of the most emotionally honest voices in American music. But behind the carefully managed photos and polished interviews, his life was already breaking apart in slow motion. The collapse did not arrive like a single blow. It came in layers, legal, financial, psychological, each one tightening around him, feeding the next until fear was no longer a feeling. It was the atmosphere he lived in. The first break was personal. In 1978, Marvin's marriage to Anna Gordy, sister of Motown, founder Berry Gordy, officially ended in divorce. It was more than a failed relationship. It was the tearing down of the one structure that had once tied him to the center of Motown's power. Friends later said the divorce didn't just hurt him, it stripped away his sense of protection. For the first time in his adult life, Marvin seemed exposed, no longer buffered by the system that had once shielded him from the full force of consequences. Almost immediately, a second blow landed. Marvin was confronted with millions of dollars in unpaid IRS taxes debts that had been stacking quietly in the background for years through bad management, denial, and avoidance. Court documents would eventually show how serious the situation really was. But in the moment, Marvin did not meet the crisis with a clear plan. He reacted with panic. Letters from the IRS went unread, then hidden. Meetings were delayed, then ignored. Problems were pushed aside like things that might disappear if he just refused to look at them. At the same time, his cocaine use deepened. What had once been recreation had turned into something closer to survival, a way to outrun his thoughts for a few hours at a time. Those close to him described wild mood swings, sleepless nights, bursts of manic energy, followed by stretches of hollow, despairing silence. Cocaine didn't invent Marvin's fear. It magnified it. It sharpened every anxiety, distorted every suspicion, and turned every worry into a threat that felt immediate and personal. By 1979, paranoia had become a daily companion. According to Frankie Gaye, Marvin started to speak openly about being watched. Not in a metaphorical, famous, scary way, but literally. He talked about unseen observers. He talked about people listening through walls. He talked about forces human and otherwise moving quietly against him. He thought they were watching him, Frankie recalled. That belief started to shape everything. Curtains stayed closed around the clock. Windows were covered, sometimes double-layered, to block any line of sight. Marvin grew wary of telephones, convinced the lines were tapped. He pulled away from managers, musicians, and even longtime friends. Trust evaporated. Isolation filled the space where trust had been. The fear took a specific shape in his mind. Someone somewhere wanted him dead. The legal and financial pressure only reinforced that feeling. After 1980, the IRS was no longer a distant threat. It was a looming presence. Court actions, demands, and deadlines tightened around him. His income became unpredictable. His lifestyle, once extravagant, now felt like a trap he couldn't afford and couldn't escape. To Marvin, none of this looked like a fixable legal problem. It looked like judgment. The belief his father had planted long ago, punishment follows wrongdoing, rose back to the surface. Marvin didn't just think he was in trouble. He believed he was being punished. If punishment was coming, then someone had to be delivering it. And if someone was delivering it, then someone had to be watching. By 1981, Marvin's fear had reached a critical edge. He left the United States and spent time in Europe, a movie presented publicly as a creative retreat. Privately, it was something closer to flight. He was trying to outrun the weight closing in on him, debt, scandal, expectations, and what he felt were unseen enemies. But paranoia traveled with him. New cities did not bring peace. They brought new rooms to darken, new curtains to close, new shadows to mistrust. The sense that danger was everywhere didn't fade. It grew more convincing. Frankie later said Marvin began to connect everything back to himself. Every setback felt personal. Every delay, every bad break felt intentional, like part of a design. And still, the cocaine stayed. It gave brief bursts of bravado followed by deeper crashes that left his mind fragile and exposed. Each cycle carved the fear a little deeper into him, leaving him more exhausted and more certain that something terrible was on its way. What makes this chapter especially haunting is how invisible it remained to the outside world. Marvin still released music. He still appeared composed when he had to. Interviews were managed. Performances were curated. To the public, he was still Marvin Gaye, the elegant, soulful legend. In private, he was a man living in a shrinking world, haunted by threats he could not name and a guilt he could not shake. People around him noticed the changes. Band members whispered about his instability. Industry insiders knew about the drugs and the tax trouble. Yet, real mental health care never took root. Treatment was sporadic, incomplete, or filtered through the lens of image management. In that era, paranoia in artists was often written off as just drugs, just stress, or just the business. So Marvin was left to navigate it alone. The tax crisis weighed heavily on him, but not like a solvable problem. It sat on his conscience like a spiritual indictment. Debts weren't just money. To Marvin, they were proof of failure, proof of wrongdoing, proof that judgment was deserved. And when you already believe you're being judged, every knock at the door sounds like a sentence being delivered. By the early 1980s, Marvin Gaye was no longer simply a superstar under pressure. He had become a man living inside a mind where danger was always present, where punishment was always coming, and where the only constant was fear. The windows stayed covered. The guns started to appear. Sleep was rare and fractured. Beneath the music, beneath the icon, a new pattern was forming, one that would eventually turn prayer into ritual and fear into the script for his final days. Satanic rituals, rites of desperation, 1982, 1983. By 1982, Marvin Gaye's fear had crossed a line you can't see on a calendar, but you can feel in every room he entered. What once looked like anxiety now demanded action. Sleepless nights no longer ended with whispered prayers alone. They ended with Patton's strange private behaviors that he carried out as if his life depended on them. According to his brother, Frankie Gaye, this was the period when Marvin began performing what he believed were acts of protection. Not ceremonies for show, not rehearsed religion, but improvised rituals he thought might delay a death he felt had already been scheduled. The setting barely changed. Dark rooms. Curtains pressed shut. Televisions off. Phones ignored. Frankie recalled stepping into spaces that felt deliberately emptied. No music playing. No casual clutter. Just Marvin, the darkness, and a sense that the world had been reduced to four walls because anything more was too dangerous to manage. Then came the candles. They weren't soft decor or romantic lighting. Marvin lit them with intent, one after the other, watching the wicks catch flame as if the timing mattered. He often left the main lights off so the candles became the only source of illumination. Shadows climbed and stretched across the walls as he moved, pacing, sitting, rising again. After the candles came the marks. Frankie described seeing symbols Marvin had sketched on paper and sometimes on surfaces nearby. They weren't crosses, stars, or any recognizable religious icons. They belonged to no church, no occult order, no known tradition. They looked rushed lines and shapes drawn over and over, as if Marvin were trying to match a pattern he half remembered or half invented. When Frankie asked what they meant, Marvin refused to offer a clear explanation. He would only say they were needed or murmur, "It's part of it." Part of what he never answered in full. The meaning lived entirely in his own head. Then came the words. Marvin had always prayed. But the prayers Frankie heard now were different. They didn't sound like gospel. They didn't sound like church. They sounded like a man trying to crack a code. He repeated phrases again and again, sometimes under his breath, sometimes out loud, sometimes stopping halfway through a sentence, only to restart, as if the syllables had to land in exactly the right order. The words were fragmented and obsessive, less like petitions to God and more like incantations built from fear and memory. Marvin believed the wording mattered. If the phrases were wrong, the protection would fail. If the steps were out of order, the shield would break. In his mind, every detail had weight. And at the center of it all was one belief: if he did it right, death could be pushed back. Not erased. Not defeated. Delayed. Frankie remembered Marvin saying, "If I do it right, it won't happen yet." Not never. Just not yet. That distinction says everything about where his mind was. He wasn't chasing salvation. He was begging for time. What made these acts terrifying was not that they were satanic in any organized sense. It was that they were solitary. Marvin wasn't following a ritual book, a cult, or a spiritual leader. There was no doctrine, no guidance, no community. There was only fear. Fear, addiction, and a lifetime of religious lessons that had taught him that punishment was always waiting just off stage. Later, people would label these practices satanic rituals. But Frankie was specific. Marvin was not worshiping the devil. He wasn't pledging himself to some dark priesthood. He wasn't a Satanist, Frankie said. He was scared. The rituals looked dark because his thoughts were dark. The room was lit by candles because he was afraid of what he imagined outside the windows. The symbols were strange because they came from a mind trying to invent its own language with no one to translate it. As 1982 bled into 1983, the rituals became more frequent. So did the paranoia. Marvin began to talk, as if God had gone quiet. The prayers that had once offered him at least a moment of relief now felt unanswered. In conversations that deeply disturbed his brother, Marvin started to blur the line between God and the devil entirely. "They sound the same now," he told Frankie. To Marvin, both represented power. Both represented judgment. Both had the ability to end him. When those two images fused in his mind, the moral map he had lived with since childhood collapsed. Faith, which had once been harsh but stable, turned into something shapeless, hopeless, and threatening from every side. This collapse showed up in the way he moved through his nights. The order of his actions mattered. The exact time he began mattered. Interruptions felt dangerous. If someone knocked, if a sound broke the silence, if he lost his place in the sequence, Marvin would become agitated, insisting he had to start the whole thing over. In his mind, a broken ritual meant broken protection. Outside those rooms, his relationships frayed. He trusted almost no one. Conversations were brief, controlled. He sidestepped direct questions. Even Frankie, the brother he leaned on most, sometimes felt held at arm's length. Marvin had convinced himself that speaking too openly could attract attention. And attention, in his logic, meant someone or something would take notice and move faster. The cocaine made everything worse. Stimulants kept him alert when he should have slept. They stretched the nights and sharpened every shadow. Sleep deprivation turned normal sounds into signals, random patterns into messages. Things that might have been shrugged off by a rested mind became evidence for his fears. A flickering light wasn't just faulty wiring. A noise in the house wasn't just someone closing a door. It was all part of the story he thought he was trapped inside. And yet through all this, Marvin was not completely incoherent. He could still speak clearly about some things. He could still work. He could still perform when required. That made it easier for outsiders to misread what they were seeing. To most people, he was just going through a rough patch. To those in the room during the rituals, he was in crisis. Frankie later said the most chilling part wasn't the candles or the symbols or the whispered phrases. It was the mood. Marvin did not sound defiant. He did not look enraged. He looked resigned. He wasn't fighting death. He was negotiating with it. He didn't believe the rituals would save him forever. He believed they might let him breathe a little longer. A day, a week, a month. That is where the heartbreak sits. By the middle of 1983, the line between ritual and reality had almost completely blurred. Ordinary events became signs. Coincidences became warnings. Every new stress fed back into this private system of meaning he'd built. He performed the rituals because he felt danger nearby. Then he used the presence of danger to prove to himself that the rituals were necessary. A loop tightening. Frankie would later describe watching his brother in those months as watching someone drown slowly, not in water, but in fear. He thought if he followed the steps, he could stay alive a little longer, Frankie said. That's all he wanted, a little more time. This chapter is often misunderstood. From the outside, it might look like a story about satanic worship or deliberate evil. But up close, it's something far more tragic. A man raised to fear God. A mind never treated for trauma. A life crushed by scandal, debt, and addiction. The rituals weren't a doorway into darkness. They were a symptom of a darkness that had already been living inside him for years. By the end of 1983, those rituals changed again. They became slower, quieter, emptier. Less repetition, more silence. It was as if Marvin had stopped believing he could hold the door closed. The window of time he thought he was buying was closing. This wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the moment he started to believe the end could no longer be moved. I've been marked when Marvin believed he'd been chosen 1983. By 1983, something inside Marvin Gaye had shifted for good. The fear that once pushed him to resist a bargain, to perform desperate rituals in the dark, had hardened into something colder certainty. He stopped talking in maybe and if. According to Frankie Gaye, Marvin began speaking in verdicts. He told me they already decided, Frankie recalled years later. That sentence was a turning point. From then on, Marvin no longer believed his actions could change the outcome. Whatever forces he imagined, divine, demonic, human, or unseen, had in his mind already passed judgment. His behavior stopped looking like escape and started looking like preparation. The obsession with protection grew, but it wasn't hopeful. It was fatalistic. Marvin began wearing a bulletproof vest inside the house, during ordinary moments, sitting, walking, talking. Not on stage. Not in a crowd. At home. The one place he should have felt safest. The vest wasn't a precaution. It was an admission. He believed violence was coming, and that his body needed to be armored at all times. At the same time, he disappeared from the world. Friends found their calls unanswered. Collaborators were kept at a polite distance. Meetings vanished from the calendar. Marvin avoided eye contact, avoided gatherings, avoided any interaction that felt like exposure. Frankie noticed that even short conversations seemed to rattle him, as if being seen at all carried risk. In Marvin's mind, no one was neutral anymore. People were either a threat or a witness to whatever was about to happen. What made this period especially tragic was the silence around real mental health care. Marvin was clearly in the grip of severe paranoia, compounded by addiction trauma and spiritual confusion. Yet, there was no steady psychiatric treatment, no consistent intervention, no structure strong enough to pull him out. In the early 1980s, behavior like his was dismissed as eccentricity, artist stuff, or just drugs. The industry minimized it. The world romanticized it. And Marvin was left alone inside his own mind. Frankie later described their talks as strangely calm. Marvin spoke about dying without drama, without tears. "It's already written," he would say. In Frankie's ears, it didn't sound like hysteria. It sounded like surrender. Even the rituals changed. The frantic pacing, the obsessive repetition, the agitated restarts began to fade. Candles were still lit, but fewer. Words were still spoken, but shorter. The energy shifted from bargaining to acknowledgement. Marvin was no longer pleading for protection. He was preparing to accept a sentence. This is where the phrase "I've been marked" reveals its full weight. Marvin believed he had been singled out, not just for greatness, which he had already tasted, but for punishment. In his mind, the pieces of his life, IRS debts, drug use, broken relationships, rage, at his father, confused faith, merged into a single story: he was guilty. Judgment was due. That belief didn't make him violent. It made him passive. Frankie noticed Marvin stopped building any kind of future. He didn't talk about long-term plans. He didn't sketch out tours or years ahead. Even music, the last refuge, lost urgency. He could still work, but the hunger was gone. Projects sounded like obligations, not lifelines. Behind closed doors, his world had narrowed to three things: rituals, silence, and waiting. The most painful detail was how thoroughly Marvin had cut himself off from help. He did not trust doctors. He did not trust therapists. He believed any intervention would turn into observation, and observation meant being watched, measured, judged. In his mind, treatment wasn't care. It was surveillance. That belief sealed the door. The paranoia fed itself. He stayed inside. He stayed armored. He stayed quiet. With each passing week, inevitability grew heavier. Frankie later said Marvin's fear was no longer sharp and panicked. It was heavy, like a weight he carried on his chest that he had given up trying to remove. It was like he was already living with the ending, Frankie said. Then came the decision many people now see as catastrophic. In late 1983, Marvin moved back into his parents' home in Los Angeles. On paper, it looked like a retreat to family, a chance to rest and recover. In reality, he was walking straight back into the place where fear had been first sown into him, where authority had been violent, where God had been taught through pain. Marvin knew that history. Frankie believed he understood it down to the bone. But by then, Marvin wasn't looking for safety anymore. He was drawn to what felt familiar. And sometimes when a person believes the ending is fixed, familiarity matters more than survival. The rituals shifted again. They were no longer attempts to change his fate. They were quiet acknowledgments of it. Marvin seemed to believe that resisting too hard might even make the outcome worse. Acceptance, he thought, might make it cleaner, less chaotic, less messy. This is what makes this chapter so unsettling. Marvin Gaye did not suddenly go mad. He arrived here, step by step, through childhood terror, unhealed trauma, public scandal, addiction, financial ruin, and a faith that had turned against him. By 1983, the idea that he had been marked wasn't a random delusion. It was the final conclusion of a lifetime spent believing that punishment was always coming. The world outside still saw legend. Inside that house, Frankie saw a man who had already said goodbye. This isn't just a story about superstition. It's a story about surrender, about what happens when fear becomes certainty, and certainty erases hope. Marvin stopped running. He waited. And once someone believes the outcome is sealed, every choice they make starts to move them toward it. Chapter 5: The Final Day When the Rituals Failed, April 1, 1984. By the beginning of 1984, Marvin Gaye had almost completely withdrawn into his parents' modest Los Angeles home. To some, it looked like a son returning to family. To those who knew the history, it looked like a loaded return to the scene of the original wound. This was not just any house. It was the place where discipline had meant pain, where religion had sounded like threat, and where Marvin had learned to connect love, authority, and violence. Yet to Marvin, going back there felt inevitable. According to Frankie, he did not frame it as a decision. He talked about it as something that simply had to happen. Inside the house, tension was a permanent resident. Marvin Gaye, sir, was older, physically weaker, but his temper had not softened. Arguments could ignite over almost nothing: a piece of paper, a chore, a raised voice, a perceived disrespect. Small sparks became wildfires. Marvin, already emotionally fragile, tried to stay out of the way. He stayed in his room. He spoke carefully. He avoided conflict. But in a house built on fear, avoidance does not erase danger. It only presses it into tighter spaces. Frankie would later say, Marvin understood exactly how dangerous that house could be. He felt it. He talked about it. And yet he also believed something else, that if death came, it would come from there. Not from strangers. Not from some distant enemy. From home. From origin. From the first source of fear. As April 1, 1984 approached, Marvin's behavior grew even quieter. Not peaceful, just tired. He barely slept. He paced. The rituals that once filled the nights had thinned out. Candles were fewer. Prayers shorter. It wasn't that he'd stopped being afraid. It was that he no longer believed anything he did could change what he believed was coming. Frankie said Marvin had reached the point where he simply thought the time has come. That morning began like any other tense, ordinary day. No dramatic farewell, no obvious omen. Marvin was one day away from his 45th birthday. There were small, simple plans. To someone outside those walls, the day would have looked almost normal. Inside, decades of unhealed violence, silence, and resentment were waiting for a trigger. The argument that started it all wasn't legendary. It was small accounts disagree on the exact cause. A disagreement over an insurance policy. Raised voices about household matters. A flash of irritation that became a storm. But everyone agrees on one thing: it escalated fast. Voices rose. Old anger surged up from the past. Authority clashed once more with a son who, even as a grown man, had never truly felt safe under that roof. Then, in a few seconds, that would define everything. Marvin Gaye, sir, picked up the handgun Marvin had given him earlier for protection. He fired. 2 bullets struck Marvin Gaye, one in the chest, one fatal. Marvin fell. No ritual guarded him. No prayer bought him another day. The death he had lived with in his mind for years showed up not as a shadow at the window, but as a gun in his father's hands. Paramedics were called. Neighbors emerged. Sirens arrived. But the outcome was already decided. Marvin Gaye was pronounced dead on April 1, 1984. News spread instantly. Around the world, people struggled to understand how the man who sang "What's Going On" and "Sexual Healing," the man who made vulnerability sound divine, could die from gunfire in his parents' house, killed by his own father. Headlines focused on the shock, the crime, the phrase "shot by his father." But that phrase flattened a lifetime into a single moment, turning a long, slow descent into a headline. For Frankie, the ending was unbearable, but not unimaginable. He later admitted that Marvin had mentioned this possibility more than once. Not with rage, not with blame, with resignation. He knew, Frankie said. He didn't know when, but he knew how. Marvin believed that if death came, it would come from the same place that had always terrified him. And that belief shaped his final months more than anyone realized. The cruel irony of Marvin Gaye's life is this. He ran from danger across cities and countries. He hid from invisible enemies, real and imagined. He armored himself against threats he thought were outside the house. But the force that ended his life had always been inside it. The man who taught him to fear God. The man who enforced obedience through violence. The man whose presence had always meant risk. After the shooting, Marvin Gaye, sir, was charged and later convicted of voluntary manslaughter. He received a suspended sentence and probation. The legal system moved on. The industry mourned. Records sold. Tributes were released. Marvin's voice became immortal. But the truth beneath the tragedy remained largely untouched. Marvin did not die just because of one argument. He died at the end of a long road paved with childhood trauma, unaddressed mental illness, addiction, spiritual confusion, and a lifetime of fear that no one ever truly stopped. The rituals in the end did not fail because they were dark. They failed because they were never aimed at the real threat. Fear had lived with Marvin from the beginning. On that final day, it simply stepped forward and acted through the person who had first taught him what fear was. Frankie would later say that the most heartbreaking part was not the violence itself, but how ready Marvin seemed. It was like he had already accepted it, Frankie said. Like he was tired of running. In his last year, Marvin did not talk much about the future. He lived as if the ending had already been written, and he was just waiting to reach the last line. The rituals were his attempt to slow time. The isolation was his attempt to stay unseen. The silence was his attempt to survive. None of it was enough. On April 1, 1984, Marvin Gaye did not lose a scripted battle with demons or secret cults. He lost a lifelong fight with unresolved fear, fear planted in childhood, amplified by success, intensified by collapse, and never truly healed. He spent his career singing about what love could be. He died trapped in what fear had convinced him life was. And the most unsettling question left behind is this. Was his death the result of dark spiritual forces, untreated trauma, a system that failed him, or all of them braided together? The rituals, the paranoia, the silence. They weren't the cause. They were the warnings. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments.